All right, welcome back, everyone. This is going to be Chapter 10, the Advocacy Coalition Framework, the ACF, Coalitions, Learning, and Policy Change by Christopher Weibel and Daniel Norstedt. Okay, so the introduction, we'll just sort of talk about where this came from and what the ACF model is sort of trying to fix, right? So much of this work is pretty new, right? The late 80s, early 90s from Sabatier and Jenkins Smith. And there's a couple things that they really are trying to fix in the policy research realm, right, at the end of the 80s. So the first is sort of dissatisfaction with the policy cycle or the stages as causal, right? And we kind of touched on this in the last chapter. Sometimes the stages of policy can be difficult if you, especially as you're sort of planning them out through an institutional game, because sometimes they can take different directions, or sometimes they can go back to a former stage, right? Like it went through sort of the policy review stage. We've chosen a policy, we try to get it implemented, but it doesn't pass, right? And now we got to go back to okay, what can we get to pass, right? These sorts of things. And so like it doesn't necessarily move through the 5 steps linearly at all times, right? And this is a sort of a critique that is shared in the IAD framework, right? The institutional analysis framework. And so yeah, this is a good critique, right? Again, models are built to try to simplify, but sometimes we do need more nuance and context. Okay, the second thing they're trying to fix in the literature is a need to take more seriously the role of scientific and technical policy and technical information in the policy process, right? So, how is information used? Where is it coming from? What are the tendencies of the actors, and how do they use information, and these sorts of things, right? Number 3, dissatisfaction with the top down and bottom up perspectives of implementation literature, right? Which is a good critique again. Sometimes, like we've talked about with sort of the state as main actor, this monolithic sort of institution, the state, right, is very top down. And then some of the literature is a little bit too, like, I don't know, it feels like optimistic about, oh, look, grassroots is creating policy, right? And so they're saying we got to come to sort of a middle ground, or maybe we can find a new way of like, how do these interact instead of just one or the other is what it is, right? Okay, number 4 thing they want to approach and sort of critique, they say we need to take a much longer term perspective on policy processes, right? So if you think about something like Social Security, right? Social Security passed in I think it was the late 1930s under the New Deal sort of priorities of FDR, right? Um, and we've moved all the way through 2026 with Social Security sort of ossified in some ways. Like ossified means like a stone. It's been stuck, right? There haven't been a lot of changes to the Social Security program in a long time because we know that the seniors are the most likely to vote. They're the most likely to have the resources to sort of push their politicians. They're the most likely to have time to sit down and write a letter or make a phone call. All of these sort of structural advantages that the elderly have, seniors, I'm sorry, mean that the Social Security system hasn't really changed much, right? Despite the fact that we know it's running out of money, that there are weird caps on like if you don't make more than 100 and I mean, excuse me, everything up to like $144,000. Don't quote me on that number, but everything up to that level is Social Security taxed, and then from that, arbitrary number, 140 or something $1,000 to a bajillion is untaxed for Social Security, right? Um, and so it's running out of money, but politicians don't want to touch it, and they can't seem to convince their publics to touch it. And so, yeah, I mean, this is going to be a train crash eventually. And so, this idea that we need a long-term view of how these things work can be very helpful in at least in specific cases, right? Um, so yeah, this is really fascinating stuff. Okay, number five, their final critique basically. They say we need to develop theories that assume sort of more realistic human agents, right, than the rational Homo economicus model of economics, right? And this is the critique we've seen over and over throughout this book and the development of sort of new approaches, right? Is that like every actor does not have full information. They do not have symmetric information with other actors. They don't necessarily know even how to maximize their sort of quote unquote utility. All of these problems, right? And this is the criticism of the IAD model that we've talked about, and the sort of the reason for the introduction of the bounded rationality perspective, right? Okay. Section 10.2. What does this framework, the advocacy coalition framework, actually look like? And what does it sort of say? And what are its assumptions, right? Okay. So 10.2.1 is the assumptions section. And assumptions are always incredibly important. It is the first thing you should always sort of look into when you're reading new science or new scientific articles. What are the assumptions we are making about how the world works and that set the core of this model, right? Because sometimes those assumptions can be problematic, right? Just like with full information and informational symmetry in the microeconomics perspective, right? Okay. So their first assumption is that the policy subsystem is the primary unit of analysis for understanding policy processes, right? So it's not at the grand sort of monolithic state level, right? And they define the policy subsystem as a substantive topic and territorial domain, along with a set of actors involved in shaping this subsystem affairs, right? So this sort of, in many ways, again, mirrors the IAD chapter we just talked about in chapters 7 and 9, right? That there are these subsystems that we need to be looking at, not the grand policy, singularity perspective, right? Okay. The second assumption that they make is the set of relevant subsystem actors includes any person attempting to influence subsystem affairs, right? And so this could be a lot of people. This is going to be voters potentially, right? Any people who show up to like city hall meetings, right? It could be labor organizations, non-governmental organizations, private entities like corporations, lobbyists, nonprofit organizations, scientists, consultants, right? All of these people and the media who sets the framework for how we think about these problems in many ways, right? Even though that's become more fractionalized since we've moved through sort of the 1990s and sort of the death of the equal time rule, right, from the FCC, which is very much under discussion again, right? But ever since then, we've seen this sort of fractionalization of the media scene, but it used to be very solidified, right? The big three basically told us what to think about the news or policy or politicians, etc. And they were often in quite lockstep with each other, right? Okay. Um, let's see. The third sort of assumption that they make is that individuals are boundedly rational, like we've talked about in the former chapter. They have a limited ability to process stimuli. They are motivated by a policy or a belief system, whether that be religious or ideological or philosophical, whatever. They have a belief system, right? This is the first time we sort of brought some of this, these actors have biases, right? Which is important. And the final piece of this assumption is that they are prone to experience what we call the devil shift, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But just like, again, the IAD model, we introduce this idea of bounded rationality, right? They're limited rationality. And to overcome these limitations, they basically assume that actors build this simplified model of the world through sort of a hierarchical belief systems, right? And this is sort of based on their core beliefs, their policy beliefs, their secondary beliefs, all these sorts of things, right? So, usually it'll be sort of high level beliefs, whether this be like religion or philosophy or lived experience or whatever it might be. And then there are sort of sub belief systems under that overarching one, right? And these are some nice assumptions to make about people, right? Because we know that, like, I don't know, when you talk to average voters, like their even their ideological political belief systems are often completely fractured and antithetical to each other in many ways, and like it's hard to believe it's hard to build or construct in your mind a perfectly hierarchical and logical sort of system of ideological beliefs, right? It's difficult, right? And most people, like I said, when we actually do sort of some, I don't know, interviewing or opinion polling or these sorts of things, there are often like I'll have some liberal ideas and then I'll have some conservative ideas, and these clash in my head, even though I claim to be liberal or conservative, right? Um, and so they're giving them a lot of leeway here, but they are also sort of saying, look, this is bounded, right? Like they don't have complete information, and they're using these sort of heuristic belief systems that they've constructed from thin air to sort of filter how I play these games, right? So it's pretty interesting, but it's hard to pin down. All right, the devil shift is when we're sort of doing poorly as policymakers or policy advocates or whatever it might be, they define it as this tendency for these actors to exaggerate the power and the maliciousness of their opponents, right? And we've seen a lot of this from both sides and in the American public, right? Where the left sort of makes the right out to be all sort of murderous fascists and January 6thers and this sort of thing, and the right makes the left out to be like psychopathic, like no core beliefs. I mean, at this point, like the Trump administration is even like calling some of these organizations like terrorist groups. So yeah, this devil shift is popping up more and more in our society, it seems like, right? Okay. The fourth assumption that they make is that subsystems are simplified by aggregating actors into coalitions, right? So instead of trying to like play out these games with like dozens or hundreds of different policy actors, we basically aggregate them into coalitional groups, right? And like how does this coalition versus the opposition coalition, like how do they organize together? How do they sort of come to compromises, all of these sorts of things, right? And basically, these aggregates, of course, come together through sort of shared policy beliefs and coordination patterns, or shared, say, religious beliefs, or whatever it might be, right? Okay. Assumption number 5. There's 7 of these, by the way. Is that policies and programs incorporate implicit theories and assumptions. Oh, reflecting, I spelled it wrong, reflecting the translated beliefs of one or more coalitions, right? And so basically, like policy is all about how these coalitions um, combat each other to put something on paper and get it out there, right? All right. Number 6, a scientific and technical information is important for understanding subsystem affairs. And this goes a little bit back weirdly to like chapter 8, the really critical sort of I don't know, let's argue about what words are kind of kind of chapter. Um, but one of the important things they said is that like despite that like there's no objectivity in existence or whatever, they also said that like policymakers have to lean on objective and verifiable and empirical information, right? And so I found that very ironic, but they're sort of bringing this up again, right? Like policymakers and those who want to even like convince the public that this is the direction we need to go generally need to show your hand, right? Show me that like there's some evidence for this, right? Okay. And then finally, we have number 7 assumption. Researchers should adopt a long time perspective. And they say at least 10 years to understand how these things work, right? Okay. Section 10.3, general conceptual categories and relations. And so the basic concepts of these ACF models and the questions that they want to answer, right? What are the policy topics that sort of define the subsystem, right? Like there are an infinite, probably not infinite, but you know what I'm saying, an infinite number of like social ills that we could try to approach, but there's just not room for all of it, nor is there time or eyeballs or whatever it might be, right? And so, like, what is the topic? Who are the actors that are playing the games, right? What are the institutional rules that sort of structure how these subsystems interact with each other, right? Number 4, how are these affected by relatively stable sort of parameters and external events, right? So, just like we talked about with Social Security, like there has been this long term sort of stickiness in Social Security policy. We haven't been able to really do anything to change things, right? And then on the other hand, if we look at say really short term patterns, right? Like how does, I don't know, an oil market fluctuation affect policy? Or how does a terrorist event affect policy? Or these sorts of things, right? So there are major differences between these things depending on external events at some time. Number 5, what are the interdependencies between other subsystems, right? So if we're talking about, say, environmental impact and the EPA and, non-governmental organizations or whatever focused on sort of environment, how does that interact with our agricultural department, right? So when we're talking about pesticides, because like what Roundup just had to pay $30 billion because they knowingly caused cancer, a bunch of people, right? And so there are interactions between institutions or policy subsystems that happen. Again, environmental versus agricultural, right? There's going to be some crossover here, or maybe like trade and foreign security, right? Like those things are going to cross over. And so, like, how do those interact, and who gets jurisdiction, who gets power, all of these sorts of things. Okay, and then finally, they say we need a long-term perspective so that we can learn things about coalition behavior, creation, destruction, reformation, how we can learn about learning, how these organizations learn and adapt, and then how we can learn about sort of long-term policy change, policy stability, whatever it might be. Okay, section 10.3.1, this is a huge chapter. First theoretical emphasis, the advocacy coalitions. And they make a very interesting distinction here. They say basically, advocacy coalitions emerge and persist because actors vary in their belief systems, and they seek to form alliances to translate these beliefs into actual policies before actors with different belief systems can do the same, right? And this is very different from the stages model, where we basically say, oh, everybody's come to an agreement over this social ill, and now we're going to all solve it. They're saying bullshit. Like the other side wants to jump on this and throw some sort of first mover advantage rule on the books before the opposition or people who think differently have a chance to do that. And so, like, this is a very remarkable sort of almost like a fascistic approach, right? Like, we need to get rules on the book now before somebody can beat us to it. And we have to follow their rules, right? And so, like, this is a really, really interesting first mover advantage, econometric sort of understanding of how policy coalitions come about, rather than the sort of, I don't know, I would say almost like naive idea that, we as a society just recognize this social ill and all come together to try to build some solution, right? So, yeah, very, very, very interesting stuff. Okay. Um, next they say basically like how is the collective action problem overcome, right? Like we're making these assumptions that these people or these groups coalesce into this sort of policy system, right? And groups that are trying to move policy, but there are issues with this idea of collective action costs, right? And so, from an econometric perspective, we have to say, okay, well, why wouldn't everyone just walk away if it's costly to do collective action? And they basically have three answers to this. They say, well, these similar belief systems sort of reduce the transaction cost of coordination, right? Like we actually want to see action. We're going to try to seek out others because we can gain a long term benefit if we can sort of influence policy. Number two, the level of coordination varies from weak to strong, right? And they talk about this later in the chapter. Um, and so they're not even saying like sometimes yes, collective action problem and their transaction costs uh, do need to be considered, right? And this is the reason why some coordination is pretty weak. Okay, and then the third is that sort of high levels of conflict, or as we'll learn in a minute, sort of failure leads to this devil shift, right? Trying to ostracize and sort of, I don't know, make subhuman or something your opponent, right? Okay. They offer a six-piece typology of coalition resources. And this is, I don't know, it's a little bit nitty gritty, but it's important too. Like, what are the resources these coalitions can throw at trying to influence policy, right? So they say first, formal legal authority to make policy decisions, right? Like, are you on some government board or some subcommittee or whatever, right? Like, what is your authority level? Two, public opinion, right? And this seems to be less and less important these days, right? As gerrymandering influences American politics, sort of public opinion is far less important than it used to be, right? Nobody has to win a general election anymore. Everybody just has to win a primary now in America, and that gets extremism. Um, that sort of means the tails are the ones being listened to and heard instead of the general population. If you think about it in a normal curve perspective, right? Gerrymandering and the primary system is leading to the dearth of politicians and policy coordinators following public opinion. Now, this is more important in other settings, right? But in the American system, it is sort of dying out, right? Okay. Number three, information. What is the level of information and what is its level of availability? Does your organization have the resources to say conduct opinion polls or do high level public policy analyses or these sorts of things, right? Number four, which is related to public opinion, is sort of mobilizational strength, right? And so this might be mobilization of voters, but it also might be like mobilization of those in your industry or mobilization of volunteer networks or, a bunch of different things. Number five, financial resources. That's pretty self explanatory. And number six, leadership. And what is the skill level of your leadership, which we have found can be very important. Okay. Section 10.3.2, the second theoretical emphasis, policy oriented learning. And we've sort of talked about learning in this course before. You get a whole bunch of different types of learning, either sort of across time within an organization or an individual. You also get learning through sort of what is that, like dissemination of policy to other jurisdictions, right? There's all kinds of different sort of ways to conceptualize learning. But they're basically saying, like, look, policymakers and advocates learn over time. We can't just assume like the same organizational strength over time because they learn how to improve. And this was sort of related to the piece about dictatorship in the last class, in the sort of political philosophy class, right? We were learning that dictators are learning how to sort of stay in power and these sorts of things. Well, it's the same concept for, political policymakers and et cetera. And then they basically lay out 4 different attributes through which learning may be explained, right, through modeling or other things, right? And this includes professional forums, maybe their level of attendance or their level of, I think some people have been doing like, who attended your sort of public forum this year in science, and then what was the sort of score of those attendees in the science journals for that year? Like cool ways of operationalizing these things, right? Okay, number 2, what is the level of conflict between the coalitions, right? And they say there's this parabolic relationship, right? It looks like an upside down U or maybe an N, without the little thing. And so they say at low levels of conflict, there's not all that much reason to do a whole lot of learning, data collection, whatever. Um, excuse me, excuse me. And because there's sort of an opportunity cost to be paid, right? Like we could throw that money at other things like organizational structure or, I don't know, uh, recruiting new members, these sorts of things, right? And then if you move on to high levels of conflict, we also see low levels of learning, right? Because what happens, they're saying, and some of the research has borne this out, is that you sort of get that devil shift, right? And this means that as you start to devil shift your opponent, make them enemies, subhuman, whatever it might be, this means that you cannot even really listen to that side's ideas or information or data or research, right? Because your own constituency or those who support your organization, when there's high levels of conflict, will make you pay a cost as a leader of one of these organizations. And so you get this severe ossification of your position and a defensive position where you sort of go through the spiral of only leaning into your own sort of ideological side, propagandist stuff, and you get stuck and your learning sort of gets maybe negative, right? And so they're saying, like, at the low and the high, you get very low levels of learning. The only time you get high levels of learning by these organizations and their actors is at this middling level of conflict, right? So fascinating theoretical ideas here. Okay. The third attribute that can explain learning potentially are sort of what are the attributes of the data, right? What are the attributes of the stimuli from which we are learning, right? Um, and if they are very highly intractable and difficult to sort of parse through, or these sorts of things, or there's a huge debate in the science or whatever it might be, then you'll get low levels of learning. And then finally, number 4, what are the attributes of the individual actors or organizations? Are they even willing to take on new ideas, these sorts of things? Okay. The final section is section 10.3.3, the third theoretical emphasis, policy change, right? And they lay out 4 ways that policy can change. External events we've talked about, like say energy supply shock, or a terrorist attack, or I don't know, the San Francisco fire or something. Internal events, right? Is there a rupture in the organization? Did you get new leadership? Did new resources get thrown at you? That sort of thing. The third is policy-oriented learning, which we just discussed above. And the fourth is sort of a negotiated agreement, right? And this can happen through, they laid out 9 different ways. A stalemate that is starting to hurt you as an organization, broad representation throughout the society, right? Which just sort of makes something like, okay, 70-80% of people agree with it, like we're going to get an agreement, right? Third, leadership, like how good is your leadership? Fourth, consensus, which is sort of related to number 2. Fifth, funding. Sixth, what is the level of commitment by your actors, right? High levels of commitment may bring more sort of benefits. Or it may get the other side to say, look, they're just not going to back down. Maybe we need a compromise. 7, the importance of empirical issues, right? How much sort of consensus is on this realm on the science, right? And number 8 is the level of trust. And number 9 is just the lack of alternative venues. Do we have to do it here? Okay, huge chapter. And I think the next one's a little smaller, so that'll be helpful. But thank you again for being here. And I will see you for the next one, which is the punctuated equilibrium model.